Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, just emerged as a leading figure in the 2024 general election. She received 655,289 preferential votes in her district, one of the highest ever recorded by a parliamentary candidate in Sri Lankan election history. What you're about to hear is an unedited, previously unreleased interview with Dr. Harini. She shares her experience as a female politician in Sri Lanka, her vision for Sri Lankan future, and the challenges that lie ahead. This interview was part of a series we released on this channel called What the Hell Happened to Sri Lanka. Now, for the full interview with Dr. Harini Amarasuriya. Who are you and what's your background and how do you fit into Sri Lankan politics?
Okay. So I'm a member of parliament. I was nominated on the national list by the National People's Power, the NPP, which is a coalition of left-wing organizations, including the JVP. And that's basically my entry into politics through that nomination. I've been politically active, not necessarily linked to a party, but as an activist, I've been doing stuff for the last 10, 15 years, particularly on education and on gender issues. And I've worked with the JVP and the NPP on policy formulation. I was on the NPP Education Policy Committee. So it was in that context that they invited me to be on the national list at the 2020 elections. And I agreed, not really thinking that, when the time came that they would pick me, but that's what happened. So it's a bit accidental, my entry into full-time politics.
Great. So this may be a bit of a loaded question, but bear with me. Sri Lanka has the legacy of having two female leaders, including a historical Sirmal Bandaranaike, because she was one of the first in the whole world to serve as a head of a country. How is it for a female politician in politics in a country like Sri Lanka?
It's tough for several reasons. The one saving grace for me is that I was nominated from a party that let's say was slightly more progressive when it came to these issues. And they picked me because I was a woman as well. So that helped. But in the bigger context, it's difficult because even in Parliament, I'm one of 12, right? There are 225 members of Parliament and I'm one of the 12 women. So woefully low participation in politics. In the Parliament, and as a result, it's a very masculine space. The debates, the tone, the setup, everything is it's aggressive. It's very masculine. So that makes it very difficult for a woman, especially if she's not really supported by her party, to make any kind of an impact. And of course, we are all judged by a different standard. So our clothes, our appearance, if we say one thing out of line, that gets, picked apart by the media, by the public. We are under scrutiny much more, I feel, than male politicians. And you're expected to behave in a particular way, right? Because you're a woman. And your behavior and your appearance is much more under scrutiny and surveillance than a male politician. But having said that, I think it's much tougher for women at local government or women political activists who are much more subject to harassment and even violence than a female member of parliament. So it's tough. It's tough if you if you don't have sufficient support from your family and from your political colleagues. It can be really quite awful.
That's fascinating to hear. As a culture, the country has a fair bit of respect towards, or at least it is perceived to have a fair bit of respect towards women. And it's the reason I led with the Bandaranaike is we also have a history of women leaders, but to hear what you say, it's an interesting paradox. You have this one end culturally, but in real life, it's an entirely different story.
Yeah. If I may just add, I think that's partly because it's not just Bandaranaike women represented a particular political elite, right? And I think that's what made the difference. If you don't come from that particular elite political class, whether you're a man or a woman, it's very hard to break into politics. And if you're a woman, it's much worse. So I think the fact that the Bandaranaike women made it is not at all a reflection of the experiences of an ordinary of a woman who comes from a different background. Yes, we respect women. We have that. If you look at our indicators, we do much better than most neighboring countries or countries that are of a same development level or economic standard. But there are real contradictions here. There are real paradox that we are a real paradox. I mean, there's also high levels of domestic violence, high levels of female self-harm, especially among young women. There's high levels of female unemployment despite the higher participation of women in education. So there are real contradictions in our society.
I think we can have an entirely separate podcast on this particular subject because it's fascinating to me. But anyway, I'm not going to get carried away. I want to now lead to really the meat of the conversation I want to have. You have had a relatively unique view of what just happened to Sri Lanka. I'm obviously referring to the economic catastrophe that led to a nationwide protest and where the country is right now. So from your vantage point of view, what happened to Sri Lanka?
Well, what happened, I think, was that the country was pushed beyond limits, and let me put it this way: a crisis that was in the making for years finally erupted in the last 2.5 years, and that there were specific reasons for that. The specific decisions that this government took toppled the country over the edge for sure. But this is not something that is surprising. I think if you really look at it, ever since independence, I think Sri Lanka has been struggling to really come up with a social contract, in terms of the rulers and citizens, the political establishment and the citizens, that was really fair by all, or was able to deliver equally to all the different communities that lived in Sri Lanka. And I think our inability to really arrive at one that was just and fair for all erupted in different forms of crisis at different points in our history, whether it's the Northeast conflict, whether it's the insurrections in the South. All of these are manifestations, I think, of that struggle that citizens in this country have been dealing with over decades. I think the last several years, the political culture became particularly corrupt and particularly self-serving and dominated by a few families, and that really pushed the country to its edges. And the COVID crisis, plus terrible mismanagement by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government of basic sort of economic policy, pushed the country over the edge. And I think the average citizen in this country felt that they've had enough, and it was time to take back their power.
All right. I want to linger a little bit on a couple of things that you've mentioned. You mentioned this is a crisis in the making, so it didn't happen overnight. But do you squarely point that finger towards the Rajapaksa governance? Obviously, they've been in power. There was a break in between, but they've been in power for about 2 decades. Do you think this was primarily caused by their policies?
Well, I think the Rajapaksa brand of politics really established something that's quite vile and extremely corrupt, right? But at the same time was also able to mobilize people to support their brand of politics on a very sort of ethno-nationalist agenda, right? And that was where they were able to establish themselves. And there were characters in the family who, like Mahinda Rajapaksa, who were extremely charismatic and extremely popular, and very good at what they did. But it was a system that was a brand of politics that finally became so sort of corrupt that, I mean, it was due to collapse. There was no way that it could be sustained. In 2015, you saw people drive them out in one election. But, what followed was equally bad. So people forgave the Rajapaksas and brought them back. But then Gotabaya proved to be so incompetent that the whole sort of thing collapsed around him. So I do, the Rajapaksas are definitely very much, I think they symbolize this corrupt, exploitative political culture that we've had for ever so long. I mean, they exemplify it, but certainly they are not the only ones to be blamed. I think it's a political class that has captured power, that held power in this country for the last 30, 40 years. They're all to be blamed, right? The Rajapaksas just took it to another level, right? But it's not, they didn't do anything very different that the others haven't done.
Let's linger on that a little bit. When you say that mismanagement, can you give us some relative concrete examples of said mismanagement?
Yeah, well, take the agriculture policy that Gotabaya Rajapaksa unilaterally imposed on the country, where overnight he banned chemical fertilizers in his drive to go towards organic green agriculture. Now, in principle, we all agree with the idea that reducing chemical use in agriculture and shifting to a more sort of green agriculture, more organic agriculture is a good thing. But it's not something you do with like switching off the lights. You don't turn the chemical agriculture light off and turn on the organic agriculture light on sort of, within 24 hours. That's not how it works. But that's what he did. And it led to a complete devastation of the agriculture sector. mean, there have been now 3 harvest seasons where farmers have been unable to properly farm, and as a result, there's been huge loss of income, plus almost sort of a halving of food production in the country, right? So that's one example. Then their fiscal policy, where as soon as he came into power, Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power, he cut back on, he reduced certain taxes, ostensibly to reduce the cost of living on people, but that's not what happened. The tax cuts actually benefited certain selected financial and economic sectors. The benefits certainly didn't trickle down to the ordinary citizen. Then the central bank chairperson, the chair of the central bank, which was a political appointment, artificially maintained the rupee at a particular level, which led to all kinds of financial consequences, where overseas Sri Lankans who remit money back to the country simply stopped doing that, or stopped using the formal channels to send back their money, because it simply wasn't in their interest to do so. And this led to a huge collapse of it contributed to the financial crisis, because for so many years, the country's foreign remittances have been the sort of main source of foreign income, of dollars, of our foreign reserves. So when that stopped coming in, it really created huge problems, which led to the debt crisis as well. So there were really stupid decisions that this government took against all advice, and stubbornly stuck to those decisions despite anybody who had any sense telling them not to. And despite huge public resistance, they stubbornly stuck to those decisions, which precipitated this crisis. As I said, pushed the country over the edge. But the main reason why we were not able to cope with all of this was because there has been, over the years, a sort of steady deterioration of the institutions and the systems that could have prevented such a crisis, right? So that's why I said, yes, it's definitely the decisions taken by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime that created that pushed the country over the edge, but the crisis was a long time coming.
I actually did not know much about the artificial holding of the Sri Lankan currency's value. What logic was used? Like, what was there must have been some advice for the government to adhere to that as a fiscal policy. Do you know, like, what were the reasoning behind it?
Well, the governor of the central bank referred to something called the new monetary theory as his reason for doing this, but that was a sort of a very weak argument, because the new monetary theory, there is such a thing where you sort of keep the exchange rate at you maintain the exchange rate at a particular level in order to manage inflation. But that, for that to work, there have to be certain other conditions that are also met. So, and certainly Sri Lanka was not meeting any of those conditions. So the logic behind that decision was extremely hard to comprehend, right? It was all evidence was there to show that this was not working for Sri Lanka, right? But they persisted with it.
Okay. Now, you did mention about, now this has been talked about and presented in various different ways, the agricultural policy. Again, my question is, Was this something? Was there any, to your knowledge, something presented to the parliament or to other politicians explaining the logic behind it and the plan behind it? How and what drove Gotabaya Rajapaksa to present this policy and then eventually acting on it?
Well, you have to understand that Gotabaya Rajapaksa is a very strange person, right? He's not your average politician is usually comes into a position of power with experience and with some kind of knowledge base and sort of teams of people advising them. And particularly the Rajapaksa brand of politics is very personality driven, right? And Gotabaya in particular was a construction of a huge media campaign as this sort of strong leader who could take tough decisions. He also has a very small team of people that he listens to and that he trusts or trusted. And among this group of people were certain people from the medical field, as well as the agriculture sector, who said that, chemical fertilizer is bad for your health, right? So this very sort of simplistic link was made between chemical fertilizer and increasing levels of cancer, kidney disease in Sri Lanka. And so in keeping with his image of being a tough leader who takes tough decisions and sticks by them, he decided this was the way to go, right? And the tragedy was that there was no one in his government who could tell him that this, or who he would listen to. I don't know whether they told him, but who certainly his cabinet and his government and the political party he represented went along with it and defended his policy against all advice and against the protests of farmers. Scores of ministry officials resigned in protest, right? The agriculture faculties in every university in Sri Lanka put out statements, advocated against it, held press conferences, lobbied against it. They did not care. They just carried on. So this has been a hallmark of this government. Their inability to listen to different views or to different opinions, and being unable to sort of respond to different ideas or different ways of thinking. I mean, I think this has been a hallmark of this regime in particular, because of course now they're completely turning face and saying, yes, this was a terrible decision to make. This was a decision that 2 years ago they defended to their death in and outside Parliament.
Right. Okay. Earlier, you also mentioned that there was corruption. What did you mean by that? I say this because I've asked people who are supportive of the Rajapaksas, and their response is generally something along the lines of they've never been convicted of any crime, and there is no evidence of a crime. How would you address that? What do you mean by corruption in that sense?
Okay. Corruption, what I mean by corruption is commissions that are demanded from any project, right? Money laundering, bribes, commissions that are taken. I mean, and corruption has been the driving force behind policy making in this country for the past several years, right? So decisions about which project the government supports or not is based on how much of a commission they can get out of it. It's not accidental that the successive governments have allocated their biggest budgets for highways and for infrastructure. That's where the commissions are. So it goes down to sort of the pettiest of levels where nothing gets past the government. Nothing gets okayed by the government without an exchange of favors happening, right? And I'm not exaggerating. So it's absolute nonsense to say there is no evidence of it. That these are just sort of stories that are being spread. That's absolute nonsense. The only reason why none of these prosecutions have been successful is because the parties in power blocked the investigations and interfered with the judiciary, making it extremely difficult for the judiciary to do their job, for the investigations in particular to happen cleanly and to happen without obstruction, right? One of the first things that Gotabaya Rajapaksa did when he became president was to set up this commission made up of a headed by a disgraced judge to bring in all the cases that had been filed against him and his family and his associates as cases of political victimization. And this commission basically recommended dismissing most of those cases and put a stop to many of the investigations that were going on, and actually prosecuted or recommended prosecution of the people who were doing the investigations, including senior police officers and people involved with the bribery commission, and those who had given evidence against the people linked to those to the government.
Right. So what do you think? There are a few other things I want to sort of delve in there, but I want to ask you this question. What do you think is the Rajapaksa legacy?
Oh, there is no Rajapaksa legacy anymore. The Rajapaksa legacy is one of corruption, nepotism, and violence, right? That's the legacy. And it's a legacy that has thankfully is on its last legs. There is no future for the Rajapaksas, not unless they completely rebrand themselves.
Right. And now let's talk about what happened to them. So the country, there was a well-publicized uprising, and for lots of people, the almost unthinkable happened, where the uprising actually was successful, getting rid of, I believe, 3 Rajapaksas, or actually 4 Rajapaksas that were in power to some degree, varying degree. And at one point, the head of the state resigned and he fled the country. But we're recording this at an extraordinary time where he's back in the country. So this is why I ask you the question, what's the legacy of the Rajapaksas? Because regardless of hundreds of thousands of people demanding their resignation, asking for quote-unquote money stolen, etc., they are still back. And I spoke to somebody who said the reason that they're back is Sri Lanka is the safest place for them. So my question to you is, why would, after all of this, Gotabaya come back to Sri Lanka?
Well, because whoever spoke to you was right, that right now this is the safest place for him, because his buddy is the president, is currently the president, and his government is still in power, right? So what you have to understand is, this is why I'm saying this is not just about the Rajapaksas. The Rajapaksas personified what was the worst about our political culture, but it is a political culture that was established and maintained and nourished by an entire class of political leaders, right? So and they've all helped each other and supported each other to remain in power. And that is and what the Aragalaya of the past several weeks and months did was to challenge that establishment, to challenge that political class in a way that they had never happened before, right? And what you see right now is that political class fighting back, which is inevitable, right? Because what is being challenged right now, and I'm saying what is, I'm using the verb is very deliberately because it's far from over, right? What is being challenged is the very nature of the political establishment, the very fundamental existence of this political culture that has been in existence for at least 40 years, right? So it's not going to go away with just sort of like 2-3 months of resistance. That nowhere in the world has it happened like that, right? So the struggle is still continuing. The resistance is still continuing. What you're seeing right now at this moment is the establishment fighting back, right? But if it would be a huge mistake to think that this is the end, that it's being resolved, that the status quo has returned, and that this is it. It's not. It's not by a long shot.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by the establishment fighting back?
Well, the establishment fighting back in that what happened when Gotabaya fled the country, or even before when Mahinda Rajapaksa, the then Prime Minister, resigned, was that he appointed someone Ranil Wickremesinghe, who personifies the establishment, the status quo, as the new Prime Minister. Then when Gotabaya fled, according to the Constitution, the Prime Minister steps in temporarily as the President, right? And then that was sort of the moment of truth for the Aragalaya, as it were, right? Because the Aragalaya had been so focused on changing the executive that, in a way, it had no plan B as to what would happen when the parliament is still in the hands of that political establishment, right? So, and that's what happened. The parliament rallied round to make sure that the establishment and the political authority was protected. So the new president was elected by the parliament. It's not elected by a popular mandate, right? So and the main the focus of the new president since the resignation of Gotabaya Rajapaksa has been to in a sense to hit back at the Aragalaya, to harass the people who've been part of the Aragalaya, to go after the leaders of the Aragalaya, because I mean it's completely to be expected. This is what they will do. This is what they have done before, except that this time round, we think they're totally underestimating the mood of the country. They're totally underestimating the anger of the people, and they're totally underestimating the impact of the current economic crisis on the lives of people, right? And they think that by simple suppression, not simple, by this sort of repressive, sort of anti-democratic actions that has usually worked in their favor, that it's going to work this time round as well. It's not going to work this time around.
Right. So the idea was one of Aragalaya's requests was the Gotabaya Rajapaksas to go home. We now have a new president, but ultimately, as you mentioned, people in power are pretty much the same people they were there before. But one of the other requests is potentially to go for an election. Now, it is kind of, the answer is relatively obvious, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Will there be an election called anytime soon in Sri Lanka to bring any sort of political stability, or will the status quo remain and Ranil see through his time given to him?
Well, we think there will be an election sooner than we think, sooner than the government thinks, right? Because this is an extremely unstable government. The president, there are already sort of rifts and conflicts between the president and the ruling party, because there is nothing in common between them in terms of their policy agendas or in terms of their style of governance, other than their desire to be in power, right? So it's a marriage of convenience. And the marriage took place purely in order to prevent a change of regime, right? And the president literally doesn't have, apart from one other member who stepped in when he became president and his position was vacant in parliament, there's no other sort of real support in parliament. I mean, he has very little support in parliament. So he is, in a way, captured by the ruling party, right? He has to compromise with them in order to remain in power. But at the same time, because of the nature of the executive presidency, he's also very powerful, right? So he can also dictate terms to the government. So there's a standoff, there's a deadlock in a way within government as well. He's been unable to really name a cabinet now, and it's over almost 3 months since he was appointed, and he's still not been able to form his cabinet because there's so much infighting, right? So the government is very unstable. There's also been defectors from the government who crossed over to the opposition because they don't agree with what happened. They don't agree with the election of the new president. So there's been a defection from within government ranks as well. So it's a very unstable government. Plus, they have yet been unable to really address the problems that people are facing, the inflation, food scarcity, the sort of the energy crisis. None of these have they been really able to address. We're still a bankrupt country. We basically defaulted, right? Since March, we haven't repaid our loans, and internationally, our support is also dwindling, because you would have noticed that the recent resolution that is due to come from Geneva on Sri Lanka is not looking good for Sri Lanka, right? Because of the sort of anti-democratic moves that the government has been taking in recent times. There's a real pushback from the international community as well. Plus, I mean, no self-respecting human rights organization can defend a president and government who's kind of come into power in this very sort of dubious way. So there are lots of problems, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of clear signs from the government that they know how to deal with any of the problems that are erupting right around them. So an election will eventually be inevitable, much sooner than expected, simply because they will not be able to continue in this way. There'll be too much pressure from people.
Generally, I mean, if I were to look at recent history of popular uprisings, whether it's the Arab Spring or what happened in Belarus, when the uprising happens, there's enormous global and local support once you hit a critical mass.
Yeah.
But what happens after the revolution doesn't leave any true hope, because, again, plenty of examples in the Middle East after the Arab Spring where things have gotten from bad to worse. Now that we talk about this election, what do you think the situation in Sri Lanka will be different? If so, why?
Well, so that's the thing. That's why for us as the NPP, it is really important that there is a clear political choice for people, right? A clear political alternative, and that there's sort of political leadership to really kind of take the Aragalaya to its logical conclusion, right? I mean, and you're right. The lessons to be learned from global incidents of this nature, this kind of revolution, is that unless there is a sort of a progressive political movement that is also able to take on in the aftermath of the struggle, things can go pear-shaped very quickly. And so in most instances, if that doesn't happen, if there is no progressive movement that is ready to kind of give leadership to the Aragalaya and capture power, then it's going to be something that's very regressive. That will be the alternative, right? And that is what has happened in other parts of the world, whereas what followed was even worse, right? So that's why it's so critically important for us in Sri Lanka that the progressive movements really understand this and take this on, and that the next phase of the Aragalaya is directed towards an election where there will be a clear alternative for people to choose from. Otherwise, what you say. What happened in other parts of the world, there is that risk. There is that risk.
What would you say to somebody now in Western media? I've read more than one article where the blame, as much as it's placed on Rajapaksas, it also puts a blame on the socialist aspect of the republic. How would you address if somebody says that it is further to the left of politics in Sri Lanka that laid the groundwork for some of the mismanagement eventually that happened?
Well, obviously, I disagree, because I'm not quite sure what you mean by the socialist elements leading to the crisis. Like what, for instance?
Well, I've read that in a particular article where the roots of the agriculture policy originates from sort of Marxist ideology. Again, this is not me saying that. This is an actual article I've read. I've read that the amount of government spent on social welfare, etc., historically and comparatively has been quite high. That's sort of what these articles are getting at.
No, I think that's completely incorrect. I don't see at all the connection between Marxist ideology and Gotabaya deciding to switch overnight from organic, to switch to organic for agriculture overnight. Where in Marxist ideology is that that makes no sense at all, right? The fertilizer policy was linked to Gotabaya having a bee in his bonnet about chemical fertilizer, and it's linked to ill health, right? nothing to do with any kind of Marxist ideology. I don't think Gotabaya understands the first thing about Marxist ideology. And this was a decision that was made very much by Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And also, it's incorrect to say that there has been this is a very common myth that Sri Lanka is somehow this welfare state, and that this welfare state has been is because of its sort of socialist influence, particularly in the 50s and 60s. The socialist influence is what established certain things like the free education system and the universal healthcare system and land reform in this country, which I don't think anyone would dispute has served the country badly, right? Where we have certainly the poverty alleviation programs like Samurdhi and what was earlier Jana Savia, all of those that came in the last 30, 40 years have contributed, have really not been effective, right? But those programs came very much from strongly neoliberal governments that chose a particular model of poverty alleviation, a sort of a targeted poverty alleviation model, which has been hugely criticized by those from the left of politics, right? As being very ineffective and inefficient, right? And also, if you look at spending, the bulk of our budget in the last 30, 40 years has been on the military, not on social welfare, right? Even in the interim budget that was presented just about 3 weeks, 1 month ago, the largest amount of money was allocated for the military. So, it's factually incorrect to say that. So, these are kind of very popular myths that are sort of, that are sort of spun without any real basis.
Well, thank you for that input. So let's talk a little bit about you mentioned the political culture of Sri Lanka. And I've spoken to many people, and this has become quite evident. People get into politics for different reasons in different parts of the world. But in Sri Lanka, and this is relevant to subcontinent, there seem to be a lot of people that get into politics for purely economic reasons. Would you agree to that statement?
Oh, certainly, for economic reasons and for the perks that go with the job.
Can you elaborate a little bit about that second part? Because I found this quite fascinating, the said perks. Now, you're a parliamentarian, and so you enjoy some of these perks. What are these perks, and how does it differ, say, for the compared to the rest of the world?
Well, so some of the perks include access to a duty-free vehicle, right? Which this parliament, to be fair, didn't get, because the duty-free vehicle was that privilege was temporarily suspended. There's a pension that parliamentarians get after serving 5 years in parliament, which is far less than what anyone else would have to, how long anyone else would have to work in order to be eligible for a pension. They are eligible for staff, for security. On a personal level, I don't use that the security that I'm allowed to use, because I think it's necessary, but most people do. Then if you're a minister, there's a telephone allowance, there's a very lavish fuel allowance, entertainment allowance, staff, right? But more than anything, it's the position that you also get housing, right? If you get government housing, if you're a minister, and if you're an out-of-town MP, you get housing in Colombo. But above all, it's the position it gives you to sort of with the, how can I say this, with your sort of, to be able to establish a kind of patronage network. There's so much power a politician has in Sri Lanka, an elected representative has. Say your supporter gets into trouble with the police, you call the police up, right? You want your kid put into a school, you call your politician to make the necessary phone calls. So the political culture in Sri Lanka and the corruption that I spoke about earlier is not just about financial corruption. It's also the patronage network that gives the politician so much power and influence over how things work or not in the country. The ability, so in a sense that the institutions have become so politicized and politicized along party lines, so that the party in power then controls all of the resources of the government and is able to manipulate those resources in the way that they want, right? So those are the privileges that they don't want to give up easily, because that's also what protects them.
Right. So you also, other than being a politician, you also have the unique perspective of somebody who's researched this space as an academic prior to this. How does a country that for decades had built a political culture like that change it, especially right now, even after this, globally reported uprising? Same people are in power, and the main people who were accused of corruption and range of other things, there's absolutely no legal recourse or whatsoever. And there's still people who'd say, I've spoken to, who'd say 9 million people voted for Gotabaya. What you saw was just the people who didn't want him in the first place. How do you see the country changing this political sort of landscape?
I think the political landscape in this country has changed significantly, and any politician in this country who doesn't recognize this does so it would be a fool not to recognize the changes that are taking place, right? It's changed fundamentally, and it is changing fundamentally. I think what the Aragalaya did was to open up the space for a real conversation that is taking place about citizenship, about democracy, about the political social contract between the political authority and the citizens. I mean, these are the conversations that were generated by the Aragalaya, right? And in a way, that is why it's, for parties such as the one that I represent, this is such a crucial moment in our history, because it provides an opportunity for significant transformation, right? I'm not saying it's a given, but certainly this is an opportunity. So what you're seeing right now is in a way like a period of sort of, huge transition. It could go either way, right? And which way it goes will depend on whether the space that has been opened up now and the opportunity that has been created now really is grasped, is made use of, and turned into something meaningful, or is allowed to just fritter away. My hope is that this it won't fritter away, that this opportunity will be grasped, and that there will be enough momentum to take this to its logical conclusion, right? But I mean, this country is changing. It's not over. What happened? This story hasn't finished, right? And we can see how much it is. The extent of that transformation we will only see in about a year or two. And my hope is that transformation will take the country, sort of capitalize on the spirit of the Aragalaya, which demanded sort of fundamental changes to this country, and has generated such a huge conversation about the nature of that transformation.
Well,
Desh, I'm sorry, I am going to have to stop at 9. I have another appointment.
Okay. So 9, let me just have a look. That is in about 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Or I will just ask 2 more questions and we'll wrap up. Okay. So my next question is, currently you're in a parliament, you represent 50% of the country, but ultimately there's only 12 of you representing that Sri Lanka. So my question is, with that hopeful message of yours, you still have to work with the people that Rajapaksas put in power, the Vikram Singhas put in power, and the Bandaranaike put in power. Yeah. They still have swaths of political and voter support. Do you really see this change happening in the year or two, as you mentioned it, or is this, do you worry that you're only speaking to the people among Aragalaya and your party, but the broader support is not there for that kind of change?
No, I think there is broader support for that kind of change, because I mean, we have conversation. We as a party, we've been one of the few parties who've been engaged in sort of grassroots level discussions, in recent times. And everywhere we go, we hear the same thing, that people are sick of the old system and want something new. They're also desperately tired, right? They're desperately tired, and there's so much frustration and anger at the state of the country, right? But there is a real desire for change. And I mean, it's completely wrong for anyone to think that the 6.9 million that voted the government in is still intact. It is not. I mean, most of the people that we are talking to who come for our meetings and who are deeply most sort of angry at this government are former supporters of this government, are people who come and tell us, we voted for them, that's why we are so angry. The people who voted for us are not so angry because, in a way, this is what they expected. So they're not surprised. But the real anger comes from those who supported this government, from among the 6.9 million who voted for Gotabaya in particular, with huge expectations of some kind of radical change. And there's real anger among them. So we think that people have changed, people are changing. And that there is real possibility and hope of transformation. I mean, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to just happen without a struggle. But we think the potential is certainly there. People are demanding something different.
Well, I hope that is the reality, but for the purposes of this podcast, I have one last question for you. Yes. I don't mean to end in a negative note, but how do you respond to critics of yours and your party's historical connection to the JVP? I've heard everything from this is getting a party like yours into power is going from bad to worse, to there's connection to NGOs that are supported by foreign governments that are bad for the country. I've seen every various versions of it. So how would you address some of the popular criticism towards you and the party?
Yeah, the level of hysteria about some of the comments that are made regarding the NPP and the JVP in particular, I think is an indication of the challenge we pose, right? If what they can throw at us is what the JVP did in 88, 89, which is like 40 years ago, or even earlier in 1971. I mean, I still think that's much better than the kinds of things that I can throw at those in power of what they did just last week. Let's talk about what they did last week, not what they did 40 years ago, right? If that's the best that they can come up with about the JVP, I think, seriously, I think we're still much better off. The NGO funding thing is like a typical kind of conspiracy story that comes from particularly the right wing and particularly the Rajapaksa political fan base, and I don't think we need to take that very seriously, because there will always be conspiracy theories, and the madder the more challenge we pose, the madder the conspiracy theories are. So that's again something that we are not surprised by. If there is any accusation that they have to make against us based on evidence and fact, we are happy to take those on board. We're happy to discuss with them, the history of the JVP and the measures that have been taken in the past 40 years to move away from that violent past, right? Which is not something that any of the other parties can say they have done. At least the JVP has confronted their violent past. I don't think any of the other political parties in this country have done so. And let's not forget that in 88, 89, it was a UNP government in which Ranil Wickremesinghe was a leading cabinet member who was responsible for over 60,000 deaths, right? Not the JVP, right? So let's talk about all of those things. I think as a country, it's not just the JVP, but as a country, as a whole, there's a lot of reckoning to do, a lot of reconciliation that needs to happen. This country has had enough violence, none of which has ever been resolved satisfactorily. None of the victims of violence have ever had an opportunity for reconciliation and for seeking justice. So let's talk about all of those. Yeah, and that's something we need to do as a country. But let's all of us then sit back and take responsibility for what happened. This sort of pinning it on the JVP is a lazy and incorrect reading of history.
I just wanted to turn on the camera and tell you thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I hope some of the questions weren't too simple, but again, it's for the purpose. I again really appreciate your time. What we'll do is, as we continue to produce this content, when it's ready, we'll definitely let you know. And if we want to ask any follow-up questions, because some of the things that you will say, I will present to other people. And if they have something that we feel as, okay, we need to follow up, we might reach out to you. But again, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Sure, you can reach out. I'm sorry I have to end now, but I kind of had another thing at about 9:15, so I really need to get prepared for that. But yeah, feel free to reach out at any time if you need some follow-up.
Thank you for listening to the discussion with Dr. Harini Amarasuriya. If you enjoyed that, don't forget to listen to What the Hell Happened to Sri Lanka, the series where we delve even deeper into the complex forces that have shaped our nation's journey.